Detective Jake Morrison had been working undercover narcotics for 8 years when the department assigned him to Willowbrook Heights. The upscale suburban neighborhood had become a major distribution hub for synthetic drugs flowing through the SC tri-state area. His mission was simple but dangerous: infiltrate the network and gather evidence on the suppliers who were using the quiet residential streets as their base of operations. The department had purchased a small ranch house at 8 Maple Street using federal asset forfeiture funds. Jake moved in posing as a freelance construction worker who traveled frequently for jobs. His cover identity was perfect for explaining his irregular hours and the need to store surveillance equipment without arousing suspicion from neighbors. The house came with membership in the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, a fact that Jake initially considered insignificant. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where people minded their own business and took care of their own properties without committees and meetings. The concept of paying fees for someone else to dictate what color he could paint his shutters seemed foreign and unnecessary. Jake quickly learned that the HOA was run with military precision by a woman named Linda Walsh, who lived in the largest house at the end of Elm Street. Linda had been HOA president for 12 consecutive years and treated the position like she was governing a small nation. She had thick binders full of covenants, conditions, and restrictions that covered everything from mailbox styles to acceptable breeds of pets. Linda was in her late 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move regardless of weather conditions. She drove a white Cadillac SUV with vanity plates that read Hopres and made daily patrols through the neighborhood, looking for violations. Her husband Bob was a retired insurance executive who spent most of his time playing golf and avoiding calls, and avoiding his wife's obsessive focus on neighborhood management. The first time Jake encountered Linda was 3 days after moving in, when she appeared at his front door carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a business suit despite it being Saturday morning. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcome committee chairwoman, then proceeded to give him a 40-minute lecture about community standards and property values. Linda handed Jake a packet of documents that included the complete HOA bylaws, a list of approved contractors for various home improvements, and a schedule of upcoming meetings and social events. She explained that all exterior modifications required architectural review committee approval and that violations of community standards would result in fines and potentially legal action. Jake listened politely while mentally cataloging the security cameras he could see from Linda, front porch, and the expensive cars and driveways that suggested some residents had income sources worth investigating. He thanked Linda for the information and assured her that he would review everything carefully and comply with all community standards. 2 weeks later, Jake received his first HOA violation notice. According to Linda's letter, his garbage cans were visible from the street after pickup day, which violated Section 12.4 of the community standards. The fine was $50, with additional penalties accruing if the violation was not corrected within 7 days. Jake was confused because he had followed the garbage collection schedule exactly as outlined in the welcome packet. He called the number provided and spoke to Linda directly, who explained that while the schedule said pickup was on Tuesday, residents were required to remove their cans from the curb by 6 p.m. the same day. Jake pointed out that this requirement was not mentioned anywhere. The documents he had been given, Linda informed him that the after-hours can removal policy had been implemented by the Architectural Review Committee 6 months ago, and that all residents should have received notification. When Jake said he had not received any such notification, Linda suggested that perhaps his mail service was unreliable and that he should consider getting a post office box to ensure important HOA communications reached him. Jake paid the $50 fine to avoid drawing attention to himself, but made a mental note that Linda seemed to enjoy wielding power over her neighbors. He had encountered similar personality types in his police work, usually people who had been given small amounts of authority and used it to compensate for feelings of inadequacy in other areas of their lives. The undercover investigation was progressing slowly as Jake established relationships with potential targets and gathered intelligence on the drug distribution network. He had identified several houses in the neighborhood that seemed to have unusual amounts of foot traffic and visitors who stayed for very short periods. The challenge was documenting these activities without arousing suspicion. Jake Jeep Wrangler was essential to his surveillance operations. The vehicle had been specially modified by the police department, his technical services unit with hidden cameras, GPS tracking, and communication equipment. The Jeep appeared to be a standard civilian vehicle, but was actually a sophisticated mobile surveillance platform worth over $200,000 in equipment and modifications. The Jeep also served as his cover story since construction. Workers often drove similar vehicles and needed to transport tools and equipment to job sites. Jake had carefully distressed the exterior and added construction company decals to make it look authentic. He kept hard hats, toolboxes, and safety equipment visible through the windows to support his cover identity. 3 months into the assignment, Jake received another HOA violation notice that would change everything. This time Linda was citing him for parking a commercial vehicle in a residential area, which she claimed violated both HOA covenants and county zoning ordinances. The fine was $500 and included a demand that he remove the vehicle within 72 hours or face additional penalties. Jake called Linda to explain that his Jeep was not a commercial vehicle, but a personal vehicle that he used for work. Linda insisted that any vehicle displaying commercial signage or used for business purposes was classified as commercial regardless of registration status. She had taken photographs of his Jeep and submitted a complaint to the county zoning enforcement office. The conversation became heated when Linda suggested that Jake purchase a different vehicle, more appropriate for the neighborhood, or rent parking space elsewhere for his work truck. Jake pointed out that many neighbors had pickup trucks, work vans, and other vehicles that could be considered commercial, but Linda insisted that his Jeep was different because of the visible tools and equipment. Jake realized that Linda had singled him out for some reason and was using HOA rules as weapons against him. He had been careful to maintain a low profile and follow all reasonable community standards, but Linda seemed determined to find fault with everything he did. The situation was threatening his cover and potentially compromising the entire investigation. He consulted with his supervisor, Lieutenant Davis, who confirmed that Jake could not simply ignore the HOA dispute since any legal action might require him to appear in court or provide documentation that could expose his true identity. The department legal counsel suggested paying the fine and complying with the parking restriction to avoid escalating the conflict. Jake reluctantly paid the $500 fine but refused to remove his Jeep from his own driveway. Instead, he installed a locking hitch and chain system to secure the vehicle when he was not using it. The lock was heavy-duty hardened steel that would require power tools to cut, and Jake figured it would discourage any attempts at vandalism or theft. Linda was not satisfied with Jake's compliance regarding the fine and continued to pressure him about the vehicle. She sent multiple letters demanding that he remove the Jeep and started appearing at neighborhood meetings with photographs and documentation about his supposed violations. Other residents began to ask Jake about his work and why he needed such a large vehicle. The situation escalated when Linda began organizing her supporters to pressure Jake into conforming to her demands. She recruited several neighbors to file additional complaints about noise, dust, and traffic related to his supposed construction work. Jake had to be careful not to defend himself too vigorously, since that might draw attention to his true activities. Linda campaign against Jake intensified when she discovered that his vehicle registration listed his occupation as self-employed contractor rather than employee of a specific construction company. She used this information to argue that he was running an unlicensed business from his home, which violated both HOA rules and HOA rules and county ordinances. She filed complaints with the county business licensing office, the zoning enforcement department, and the tax assessor, claiming that Jake was operating a commercial enterprise without proper permits. Each complaint required Jake to respond with documentation and explanations that could potentially compromise his cover identity. The pressure from Linda, harassment, was affecting Jake's ability to conduct surveillance operations effectively. Was spending too much time dealing with HOA issues and not enough time gathering intelligence on the drug network? Worse yet, the constant attention from Linda and her supporters was making other residents suspicious about his activities. Jake supervisors suggested that they might need to abandon the investigation and relocate to a different area but Jake was reluctant to give up after months of establishing his cover and making progress. He had identified several key players in the drug distribution network and was close to gathering enough evidence to make arrests and seizures. The situation reached a crisis point when Linda obtained a copy of the county property records and discovered that Jake House was purchased with cash by a limited liability company rather than through a traditional mortgage. She used this information to fuel speculation about his finances and suggest that he might be involved in illegal activities. Linda began spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood that Jake was not really a construction worker, but possibly a drug dealer or other criminal who was using the house for illegal purposes. She organized informal surveillance of his activities and encouraged his neighbors to report any suspicious behavior to local authorities. The irony was not lost on Jake that, while he was conducting legitimate law enforcement surveillance, Linda and her supporters were conducting their own amateur investigation that could potentially interfere with his actual police work. The situation had become a dangerous comedy of errors that threatened to expose his true identity. Jake knew he needed to resolve the HOA conflict before it completely destroyed his cover operation. He decided to try a direct approach and requested a private meeting with Linda to discuss their differences and find a reasonable solution to the ongoing disputes. Linda agreed to meet, but insisted on bringing 2 other HOA board members as witnesses. The meeting took place in the community center with Linda sitting behind a conference table like she was conducting a formal hearing. She had prepared a presentation outlining all of Jake's supposed violations and demanding immediate compliance with her interpretation of HOA rules. Jake tried to explain that he was simply a working person trying to make a living, that his vehicle and activities posed no threat to the neighborhood or property values. Linda interrupted him repeatedly and refused to consider any compromise solutions. She made it clear that she would not stop pursuing violations and fines until Jake either conformed completely to her demands or moved away from the neighborhood. The meeting ended with Linda issuing an ultimatum that Jake had 30 days to remove his Jeep from the property permanently or face escalating fines and legal action. She also demanded that he provide detailed financial information to prove that he was not operating an illegal business from his home. Jake left the meeting knowing that Linda had declared war on him and would not stop until she had driven him out of the neighborhood. He also realized that her obsessive behavior and need to control others suggested psychological issues that went beyond simple HOA governance. Linda seemed to have fixated on him as a threat to her authority and would not be satisfied with anything less than total capitulation. The next morning, Jake woke to find that someone had placed orange traffic cones around his Jeep with signs reading, "Commercial vehicle illegally parked." Linda had also posted flyers throughout the neighborhood advertising an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the ongoing violations at 847 Maple Street. Jake removed the cones and signs, but knew that Linda was escalating her harassment campaign. He installed additional security cameras around his property and began documenting every interaction with Linda and her supporters. The situation was becoming personal rather than professional, and Jake had to resist the urge to respond with equal aggression. 3 days later, Jake returned from a surveillance operation to find that his Jeep was missing from his driveway. The heavy-duty lock and chain had been cut with what appeared to be a professional grade cutting tool, leaving behind twisted metal remnants. There was no sign of the vehicle anywhere in the neighborhood. Jake immediately called 911 to report. The theft then contacted his police supervisor to explain the situation. Lieutenant Davis was furious that department property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had been stolen and ordered Jake to cooperate fully with the investigation while maintaining his cover identity. The responding patrol officers took a theft report and began canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses. Several neighbors mentioned seeing Linda and her husband Bob near Jake's driveway earlier that morning, but claimed they had not witnessed the actual removal of the vehicle. The timing suggested that the theft had occurred during the day when most residents were at work. Jake provided the responding officers with video footage from his security cameras that showed Linda and Bob examining his Jeep and the locking mechanism around 7 a.m. that morning. The footage was not clear enough to show them actually cutting the lock or taking the vehicle, but established their presence at the scene. Within hours of filing the theft report, Jake received a call from Linda informing him that his illegally parked commercial vehicle had been towed in accordance with HOA enforcement procedures. She claimed that the HOA had the authority to remove vehicles that violated community standards and that Jake could retrieve his Jeep by paying outstanding fines and towing fees. Jake asked Linda for details about which towing company had been used and where his vehicle was being stored, but Linda refused to provide that information. She insisted that Jake would receive official notification through the mail within 5 to 7 business days, and that all questions should be directed to the HOA attorney. The conversation confirmed Jake's suspicions that Linda was directly involved in taking his Jeep, but also revealed that she believed she had legal authority for her actions. Linda seemed genuinely convinced that HOA covenants gave her the right to remove vehicles from private property without owner consent and without following standard legal procedures. Jake immediately called Lieutenant Davis to report that the theft suspect had contacted him and claimed responsibility for removing the vehicle. Davis ordered Jake to continue playing his cover role while detectives from the auto theft unit took over the investigation. The situation had evolved from an undercover narcotics operation to a major theft case involving department property. Detective Maria Santos from auto theft arrived at Jake's house that evening to interview him about the missing vehicle. Santos was a 15-year veteran who specialized in complex theft cases involving organized crime and had extensive experience with surveillance equipment and undercover operations. Jake briefed Santos on his undercover assignment and the ongoing conflict with Linda Walsh, while being careful not to compromise any aspects of the narcotics investigation. Santos immediately understood that recovering the stolen Jeep was critical, not only because of its value, but because the surveillance equipment inside could potentially expose Jake's true identity. Santos began her investigation by researching Linda's background and discovering that she had no legal authority to authorize vehicle towing from private property. HOA covenants could regulate parking on common areas and streets, but could not override private property rights or supersede state laws regarding theft and trespassing. The next day, Santos interviewed Linda at her home and found her to be cooperative but completely unrepentant about her actions. Linda insisted that she had acted within her authority as HOA president and that Jake Jeep was a legally parked commercial, a vehicle that needed to be removed to protect neighborhood property values. Santos asked Linda for documentation, showing her legal authority to remove vehicles from private property, but Linda could only provide HOA covenants that clearly did not grant such powers. When Santos explained that taking someone's vehicle without legal authority constituted theft, Linda became defensive and claimed she was being persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. The interview revealed that Linda had convinced herself that her role as HOA president gave her broad law enforcement powers that she could use to compel compliance with her interpretation of community rules. She seemed genuinely surprised that police were treating her actions as criminal rather than legitimate community governance. Santos also interviewed Bob Walsh, who appeared extremely uncomfortable discussing his wife's actions. Bob admitted that he had helped Linda research towing companies and had driven her to where the Jeep was being stored, but claimed he had not understood the legal implications of what they were doing. Bob revealed that Linda had paid a private towing company called Metro Recovery Services to remove Jake Jeep from his driveway. The company had required Linda to sign paperwork claiming that she had legal authority to authorize the tow, but had not independently verified her claims or the legitimacy of her authority. Santos contacted Metro Recovery Services and discovered that they had Jake Jeep in their impound lot, but had been instructed by Linda not to release it without her written authorization. The towing company manager admitted that the paperwork seemed questionable, but said his company often dealt with HOA disputes and assumed Linda had proper authority. The impound lot was located 15 miles away in an industrial area that specialized in storing vehicles involved in legal disputes and insurance claims. Santos obtained a warrant to inspect the Jeep and confirmed that the surveillance equipment had not been compromised or discovered by the towing company employees. When Santos arrived at the impound lot, she found Jake Jeep parked among dozens of other vehicles in various states of damage and decay. The vehicle appeared to be intact, but had obviously been searched by someone who was looking for evidence of commercial use or illegal activity. The glove compartment had been opened and papers scattered around the interior. Toolboxes had been moved and opened, though nothing appeared to be missing. Most concerning was evidence that someone had attempted to access the hidden surveillance equipment compartments. Though they did not appear to have succeeded in exposing the sensitive electronics, Santos documented the evidence of unauthorized search and seizure, then arranged for the Jeep to be transported to the police department technical services garage for complete inspection. The violation of the vehicle security could potentially compromise the entire undercover operation and expose Jake to danger from the drug dealers he was investigating. Technical services confirmed that while the surveillance equipment had not been discovered or damaged, the attempts to access hidden compartments suggested that whoever had searched the vehicle was looking for something specific. The search pattern indicated some knowledge of how undercover vehicles might be configured rather than random curiosity. Lieutenant Davis made the decision to continue the undercover operation, but with enhanced security measures and backup surveillance to protect Jake's identity. The theft of his vehicle had actually provided an opportunity to arrest Linda Walsh and potentially send a strong message to other residents about interfering with law enforcement activities. Santos prepared criminal charges against Linda, including grand theft auto, burglary, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential sentences of several years in prison and substantial fines. Bob Walsh would face lesser charges related to his role in the conspiracy, but could avoid prison time by cooperating with the investigation. Jake was surprised by how quickly the case against Linda came together once Santos took over the investigation. Within a week, Linda had been arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to the theft of his Jeep. The arrest warrant was executed at her home during the morning HOA patrol that she conducted every day. The arrest scene was dramatic as Linda refused to believe that police had the authority to arrest her for what she considered legitimate HOA enforcement activities. She demanded to speak with the sheriff and the county attorney, claiming that she was being persecuted for trying to maintain property values and community standards. Bob Walsh was arrested the same day at his golf course, where Santos found him trying to pretend that nothing unusual was happening in his life. Unlike his wife, Bob immediately understood the seriousness of the charges and expressed willingness to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced penalties. News of Linda's arrest spread quickly through Willowbrook Heights, creating shock and confusion among residents who had supported her strict enforcement of HOA rules. Many neighbors had contributed to her campaign against Jake and were now worried about their own legal exposure for participating in harassment activities. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss Linda's arrest and determine how to proceed with neighborhood governance. Several board members resigned immediately rather than risk being associated with criminal activities. Others demanded a complete review of all HOA enforcement actions to ensure they had been conducted legally. Jake attended the emergency HOA meeting to observe resident reactions and gather intelligence on potential drug network connections among the neighbors who had supported activities. He was surprised to discover that several residents seemed more concerned about protecting their own interests than understanding why Linda had been arrested. Some residents suggested that Linda had been entrapped by Jake, that he had deliberately provoked the conflict to create legal problems for the HOA. Others argued that Linda's actions, while misguided, had been motivated by genuine concern for the neighborhood and did not deserve criminal prosecution. The meeting devolved into chaos as residents argued about whether to support Linda's legal defense or distance themselves from her actions. Jake realized that Linda had created deep divisions within the community by using HOA authority to settle personal disputes and control neighbors. Behavior. During the weeks following Linda's arrest, Jake was able to refocus on his undercover narcotics investigation without constant harassment and interference. He discovered that some of the residents who had most strongly supported Linda's campaign against him were involved in the drug distribution network he was investigating. The connection was not coincidental, as Linda's obsessive surveillance of neighborhood activities had made her aware of unusual traffic patterns and suspicious behavior at certain houses. Rather than reporting these observations to police, she had used the information to build alliances with residents who might otherwise have opposed her authoritarian management style. Several neighbors who had participated in Linda's harassment campaign were arrested during the drug raids that concluded Jake's undercover operation. These arrests revealed that Linda had unknowingly been providing cover for criminal activities by focusing community attention on manufactured violations rather than actual illegal behavior. Jake's testimony in Linda's criminal trial revealed the extent of her harassment campaign and the impact it had on his legitimate law enforcement activities. The judge was particularly troubled by Linda's attempt to interfere with an ongoing police investigation and her use of HOA authority to conduct what amounted to vigilante law enforcement. Linda was ultimately convicted of grand theft and sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Bob received a suspended sentence and community service in exchange for his cooperation and testimony about his wife's activities. The HOA was dissolved and reformed with new leadership and stricter oversight procedures. The case became a landmark precedent for HOA authority and the limits of community governance. Legal experts used Linda's conviction to educate other HOA boards about the difference between enforcing legitimate covenants and engaging in criminal harassment of residents. Jake's successful completion of the undercover investigation resulted in the arrest of 15 people involved in the drug distribution network and the seizure of over $2 million in drugs and assets. The operation was considered one of the most successful undercover investigations in department history, despite the complications created by Linda's interference. The stolen Jeep was returned to service after complete inspection and upgrading of its surveillance equipment. The vehicle became something of a legend within the police department as the undercover car that had been stolen by an HOA president and recovered through a grand theft prosecution. Jake was promoted to sergeant and transferred to the Major Crimes Unit, where his experience with complex investigations and undercover work made him a valuable asset. He occasionally drove through Willowbrook Heights and was pleased to see that the neighborhood had returned to normal suburban calm without Linda's aggressive enforcement activities. The house at 847 Maple Street was sold to a young family who were unaware of its history as an undercover police operation. The new residents joined the reformed HOA and participated in community activities without the fear of arbitrary citations and harassment that had characterized Linda's regime. Linda served 18 months of her sentence before being released on parole with conditions that prohibited her from holding any position of authority in homeowners associations or similar organizations. She moved to a different state where she lived quietly and avoided any involvement in community governance activities. The case file for the theft of Jake's Jeep became required reading for police academy students studying undercover operations and community relations. The incident demonstrated how civilian interference could complicate law enforcement activities, and the importance of maintaining operational security during extended investigations. Bob Walsh remained in Willowbrook Heights, where he became active in community volunteer activities and worked to rebuild relationships with neighbors who had been affected by his wife's actions. He often spoke about the importance of questioning authority figures and not blindly following leaders who abuse their positions. The Metro Recovery Services Towing Company faced civil lawsuits from Jake and the police department for their role in the illegal vehicle seizure. The company eventually paid substantial damages and implemented new procedures for verifying the authority of people requesting vehicle towing services. Detective Santos received commendation for her investigation of the vehicle theft and her professional handling of the complex case involving undercover operations. Work became a model for how to investigate crimes that intersect with ongoing law enforcement activities without compromising operational security. The reformed Willowbrook Heights HOA adopted new bylaws that strictly limited enforcement powers and required all actions to comply with state and federal laws. The new leadership emphasized voluntary compliance and community cooperation rather than aggressive citation and fine policies. Several years later, Jake reflected on the strange case of Linda A. Walsh and how one person's obsession with control had nearly derailed an important criminal investigation. The incident had taught him valuable lessons about dealing with civilian interference and the importance of maintaining professional composure under pressure. The case also highlighted the potential for abuse when people are given authority over their neighbors without proper oversight or accountability.